At its peak, this Silicon Valley healthcare startup reached a valuation of $9 billion. When the numbers finally plummeted to zero, the collapse wiped out massive investment fortunes and left thousands of patients with highly inaccurate medical data. The victims of the fraud were not naive amateurs. Highly experienced figures in government, global media, and institutional finance bought into the company's premise without verifying the underlying science. The entire enterprise rested on a single fatal deception. The revolutionary medical technology at the center of the company simply could not perform the diagnostics it claimed. The resulting fallout exposed a distinct vulnerability in Silicon Valley culture, a willingness to prioritize the promises of a charismatic, visionary founder over empirical evidence. In 2003, a 19-year-old named Elizabeth Holmes dropped out of Stanford University, using her tuition money to fund a medical startup. She pitched a device capable of running dozens of comprehensive lab tests from a single prick of the finger, completely bypassing traditional syringes and large blood draws. She deliberately cultivated the persona of a tech visionary, adopting a uniform of black mock turtlenecks and speaking in an artificially lowered voice to command authority in boardrooms. This careful presentation worked. After a single 2-hour meeting, former U.S. Secretary of State George Shultz agreed to join her board of directors. He was soon followed by other towering political figures like Henry Kissinger, giving a completely unproven health company one of the most prominent corporate advisory groups in U.S. history. This accumulation of elite political backing provided the company with an impenetrable aura of prestige. It functioned as a shield, keeping medical researchers and skeptical regulators from looking too closely at the actual science. Behind the doors of the Palo Alto headquarters, the daily reality was heavily guarded. Scientists worked in strict isolation from one another, information was tightly siloed, and internal communications were strictly monitored. The secrecy was necessary to hide a massive internal failure. The proprietary blood testing devices, known as Edisons, were failing basic quality control checks and producing highly erratic data. When high-profile dignitaries like Vice President Joe Biden visited the facility, executives guided them through a physical staging area specifically constructed to look like a cutting-edge, fully functional laboratory. Away from the VIP tours, lab technicians were secretly diluting patient blood samples and running them on standard commercially available machines purchased from outside manufacturers. Employees who noticed these discrepancies and brought their concerns to management were routinely stonewalled, reassigned, or terminated. The operation had split into two parallel tracks: the pristine technological narrative sold to the public and the failing, hidden mechanisms actually processing the blood. A small group of junior staff members, including Tyler Shultz, the grandson of board member George Shultz, realized the danger of the situation and began quietly documenting the failures. The faulty data was actively leaving the lab. Patients were receiving incorrect results for critical health markers, impacting sensitive treatments for cancer and altering dosages of dangerous blood-thinning medications. In response to leaks, the company deployed aggressive corporate lawyers to track down suspected whistleblowers, threatening young scientists with financial ruin and heavy litigation. This culture of intimidation successfully masked the problems from federal inspectors. Early visits from the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services were carefully managed to conceal the malfunctioning Edison machines from regulatory oversight. Lab technicians were caught in a severe psychological bind. They had an ethical obligation to report dangerous medical practices, yet faced immense, career-ending legal pressure to remain silent. Falsifying financial projections defrauds venture capitalists. Manipulating clinical diagnostics turned a corporate deception into a direct, calculated hazard to public health. While the internal testing system collapsed, external investments continued to soar. Media magnate Rupert Murdoch poured over $100 million into the operation. The DeVos family contributed an additional $100 million, entirely blind to the daily crises occurring inside the laboratories. Outside the Silicon Valley investment bubble, medical professionals began noticing a complete absence of peer-reviewed data supporting the company's ambitious claims. A practicing pathologist eventually analyzed the claims and bypassed the corporate lawyers, passing a tip directly to Wall Street Journal investigative reporter John Carreyrou. The strict asymmetry of information had finally reached its breaking point. The hidden realities of the lab were leaking into the public domain. Carreyrou launched a secret, months-long investigation, interviewing terrified former employees and securing hidden copies of the manipulated lab results. Once executives realized a major exposé was underway, they launched an intense counterattack, using severe legal and financial threats to silence the whistleblowers and halt publication. The survival of a $9 billion empire now rested entirely on a knife's edge, waiting to see if a small group of intimidated whistleblowers would hold their ground against a battery of corporate lawyers. On the surface, the public myth still stood tall, but the evidence was already on the record, and total collapse was now inevitable. Transitioning to the Betrayal Archive, Part B. In the early 2010s, Elizabeth Holmes was the celebrated face of Silicon Valley innovation. Her blood testing startup reached a $9 billion valuation, based on the promise of making diagnostic testing accessible and painless for everyone. But behind the high-profile interviews and magazine covers, the company's headquarters operated under a cloud of internal suspicion and paranoia. Employees were strictly compartmentalized, with leadership actively forbidding teams from sharing data or discussing their progress with colleagues in other departments. This enforced isolation created an environment where the public narrative remained unchallenged from within, as no single employee possessed enough information to verify if the technology actually worked. The first signs of friction came from the medical community, where researchers noted a total lack of peer-reviewed data to support the claim that hundreds of tests could run on a single drop of blood. Journalistic scrutiny followed when reporter John Carreyrou began investigating the company's internal claims and the actual performance of its proprietary machines. His reporting relied on whistleblowers, staff members who chose to expose the internal discrepancies, despite the severe professional risks of breaking their non-disclosure agreements. Management responded with aggressive intimidation, deploying high-profile lawyers to threaten anyone suspected of providing information to the press. This level of resistance suggested that leadership prioritized the billion-dollar secret over scientific validity, turning a technical struggle into a high-stakes investigation. As the corporate drama unfolded, the deception reached directly into the lives of patients, relying on the technology for their basic health. Doctors were making critical medical decisions, including the dosage of sensitive medications like blood thinners, using data that the company knew was inconsistent. The danger was confirmed when the company voided 2 full years of patient blood test results, admitting the data was unreliable. This invalidation affected a massive percentage of the total tests generated by their proprietary machines, effectively erasing years of clinical history. Releasing these flawed tests into the real world constituted a betrayal of public trust that reached far beyond financial fraud. Maintaining the appearance of success required elaborate staging, including the construction of fake laboratories to deceive visiting politicians and investors during tours. The subsequent Wall Street Journal exposé shattered this curated image, forcing financial backers to recognize that their investment capital was gone. Corporate partners faced immediate fallout. Walgreens realized the testing centers installed across its stores utilized non-functional technology that put their customers at risk. The internal structure began to dissolve as key executives left the company, marking the first major casualties of the crumbling public facade. The simultaneous exit of partners and media supporters demonstrated that the entire company had been sustained by momentum rather than results. Federal health regulators intervened, revoking laboratory licenses and declaring that the company's operations posed an immediate jeopardy to patient safety. The investigation expanded when the SEC charged leadership with an elaborate fraud, alleging they had actively misled both investors and government officials. The Department of Justice eventually stepped in to issue federal indictments for multi-million-dollar wire fraud and conspiracy schemes. Under the weight of these subpoenas and charges, Elizabeth Holmes was forced to step down, ending her tenure as the company's leader. The shift from celebrated icon to criminal defendant occurred the moment hard regulatory evidence replaced venture capital speculation. The federal courtroom became the final venue for the saga, a place where carefully crafted public relations could not hide from empirical evidence. Testimonies from former lab directors and whistleblowers provided a detailed account of the deception, making the scale of the failure undeniable to the jury. Juries eventually convicted both top executives on multiple counts of wire fraud and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. The court delivered sentences of over a decade in federal prison for each executive, reflecting the gravity of the crimes. These prison sentences served as a legal reckoning for the decision to prioritize a charismatic narrative over actual patient safety. And the aftermath, the frantic energy of the trial, was replaced by silence. The company liquidated its remaining assets and officially ceased all operations. Hundreds of millions of dollars from high-profile investors were rendered worthless, marking one of the most significant financial losses in the region's history. The saga leaves us with a central question. How did so many experienced and powerful people choose to believe such a massive fabrication? In an ecosystem heavily incentivized to find the next technological miracle, the pressure to believe a compelling story often overrides standard due diligence. When we choose to blindly trust a charismatic narrative over hard physical evidence, we invite a catastrophic and total deception.